hear me? All right. Okay, so I can take my mask off because I'm alone. I am going to do, like I said, a broadcast of... Give me a sec. I'm not sure how I did this, but I'm going to have to re-type this up to get my monitor going. I hate not having a mouse, that's for sure. Keep on grabbing the mouse. Oh, God. Sorry. Okay, so I said I was going to do a very quick broadcast on YouTube about the things about the French coming in. The folly of the French. So I just want to get just a couple things. I'm going to go very fast and cover this. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. And I see only a few people or not many people are watching right now, but I'm going to broadcast it. I'll post it online. So it will be on the YouTube. And so you can check it. And just a couple things about what we're going to do with this. So I'll post this up there. You're going to be responsible for it on the test. There'll be questions about it and everything else. I also posted a quiz over the first 2 sections of the reading. I think it's 8 or 9 questions. It's on Teams, and so get it done over the next day. Also, we're going to start the Fog of War tomorrow. And for everybody who is going to be online tomorrow, so B-Day and digital learners, it's going to be on Teams. I have to broadcast it there. I can't broadcast it on the YouTube because they will go nuts for copyright reasons. And so I'll broadcast it, and there will be an assignment with it. And I'm not sure how I'm going to get it online. I don't think I'm going to get the whole movie on there. It used to be on the Internet Archive, but I guess copyright issues, they took it off. This was an Academy Award winning movie. And so, they scrubbed those pretty clean. I might be able to broadcast it and get it on Teams, a recording of it, but that might be... I'll cross that bridge when I get there. But I might be able to do that, but it doesn't look good. But if I can, I will. And I'm trying to think of anything else. So I'll broadcast it. Make sure interviews, by the end of the week, you should have somebody. And so either just drop me a note on Teams, just saying who you're going to be interviewing for that interview project. And don't forget, when we talk about the folly of the French, then right here, these quick little notes, don't forget the Truman Doctrine. The idea that all communists are related to each other. They're all being directed from the Kremlin. Every communist is indivisible and one and the same. And because of the domino effect, they called it then. Because of the domino effect, we're all vulnerable. And the next thing you know, Wyoming will topple. And so, with that, think about that when we talk about the French. So here are the French. They had a colony in French Indo-China. They conquered it at the end of the 19th century. They conquered the South first and then the North. There's a reason why South Vietnam would be the area the United States would try to maintain. There was a longer French influence. More people had converted to Catholicism. Worked with the French, aka collaborators. And so I know I have the screen in here. I'll point to my screen up here. That gives me something to look at. I don't know. Excuse me. I don't know if this is going to work. I'm about to figure things out. It's very odd teaching this way. It was odd at home, but I kind of set it up here. It's just weird with an empty room. Okay, so with that, the fall of the French, and here are French forces, and this is outside of Hanoi, and this is Dien Bien Phu. So a couple things to show you very quickly. These are the flags. The flag right here, so the yellow flag with the blue stripes, that's the flag of the French colony of French Indo-China. And notice how that looks. Here's the flag of the Viet Minh, we'll talk about them in a second, and the French flag. But when the war actually started going, For the United States, oh, that would become the flag of Vietnam. South Vietnam would basically copy the French Indo-China flag. They would just change the stripes, partially because they could say, well, we no longer have Cambodia and Laos. And that would be the flag of the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front. You notice it's kind of a combination, and you got the blue in there from the old French Indo-China flag. And so, a couple things very quickly. The Viet Minh were nationalists in Vietnam. And some were socialists, but their biggest goal is they wanted independence. Kick the French out. So the Viet Minh wanted an independent Vietnam for the Vietnamese people. So they wanted this nationalist nation, but also Cambodia and Laos. So Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And they had been created at the turn of the century, fighting against French rule. And there have been a couple small-scale revolutions that did not obviously succeed at first in the early 20th century. But then World War II intervened. And a couple things about World War II. When Japan, which was already at war and taken much of the Chinese coastline, and it turned into a quagmire for China, they wouldn't, or for Japan, they wouldn't leave China. They, instead of, well, ending this disastrous war, they doubled down. And when France fell in 1940, Vietnam in two stages would take, Japan in two stages would take the northern part and then the southern part of French Indochina, because France fell to the Germans. The United States panicked. Here's the U.S., very isolationist, didn't want to be in World War II, and yet Germany had knocked out most of Western Europe and Poland, and only Britain remained. And Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, correctly saw Hitler, as a grave threat to the United States. War in Europe is going to happen. And he was really worried that Germany would win. Who knows what the future would win if this fascist power in Germany took over? And that's not even mentioned the horrific totalitarian state in the Soviet Union, which appeared to be allied with the Germans at that time. So he didn't want any more Japanese expansion, which could lead to a colonial war in the Pacific. So the United States embargoed oil to Japan. Japan got over 90% of their oil from the United States, especially aviation fuel, important for war. And they embargoed the oil because of French Indochina, hoping to stop Japanese aggression to avoid a war in the Pacific coinciding with a war in Europe. Well, this pushed Japan to attack to attack the Dutch East Indies, which is today Indonesia, to get the oil they wanted to fight the war. To their point of view, we can't back down, so we're going to take more oil. But to make sure that nobody stops them from getting, it's like the bells never quit. No one stops them to get oil. To get this oil, they attacked the United States, including Pearl Harbor, so the U.S. would be cowed and not enter the war. It totally backfired, and the U.S. entered the war in Japan. That would be the doom of Japan. But the Viet Minh fought the Japanese in Vietnam, and the U.S. helped them. A way to battle back against the Japanese. And these are Viet Minh soldiers. This is actually 1954, but I put them in there. And Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Viet Minh. And Ho Chi Minh, I should mention, he was at the 1919 negotiations that would lead to the Treaty of Versailles, saying, hey, if everyone's talking self-determination and the war was fought to make the world safe for democracy, which the U.S. said, shouldn't the treaty ending the war allow for independence for places like Vietnam? And of course, he was almost laughed out of the place. Britain and France weren't going to give up their colonies. But in 1945, Japan was defeated. And in the vacuum, the Viet Minh came into Hanoi and declared independence and wrote their constitution, and the first words justifying their state were directly based upon the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And they assumed, and I would argue correctly, it seemed like a correct assumption, that the U.S. would aid them. Franklin Roosevelt spoke out against colonization. FDR, and I don't have a picture of him, by the way, that's Ho Chi Minh. That's him in the 50s, that's him in the 60s. France wanted to keep their colonies. And I kind of messed things up here, but FDR spoke against colonization. France desperately wanted, though, their colonies. After the war, they wanted to show that it was an aberration they lost to Germany and they were great again. And so, I keep on coming back to the great again. That was a very Italian thing. Reagan would use it. I think you know where it's being used now. But, Italian as in Mussolini. FDR was anti-colonialism. And he was telling Britain, you're going to have to give up your colonies. We want people to decide their own fate, because if they don't, there'll be more war. That's another story. But Truman was president when the war ended. And Truman was terrified of the Soviet Union. He hated Stalin and feared him, assumed Stalin was out to conquer the world. Part of the reason for dropping the atomic bombs was to intimidate the Soviets. And Truman's thinking about what's going to become the Cold War. So the U.S. helped France get their colonies back. Because they look at it like this. France will become an important bulwark against the growing power of the Soviet Union. When the Soviets defeated the Germans and then drove into Central Europe, they conquered all this area. And, okay, the Soviets are thinking a buffer zone between them and Germany. But to the American point of view, to Truman's thinking, they're going to try to take it all. So we need a strong France, and how do we get a strong France? Easily. Help them get their colonies. Now, by the way, this is crazy talk. It's bad thinking. France wanted their colonies because they were humiliated in World War II. What a stupid reason to go to war. Gee, countries do it all the time, though. And this is American propaganda trying to say, France, we liberated France, must stop the communists. And so with that, here's Ho Chi Minh. And this is his main general, General Nguyen Giap. Right here, Ho Chi Minh and Giap. And so they're going to fight a guerrilla war. The French came in. They're going to get a little bit of aid from the Soviets, but Stalin was very reluctant to anger the United States. Despite what the Truman Doctrine said, Stalin knew that that the Soviets were devastated by war, and it's going to need time to rebuild. But China was something else. Remember, we mentioned this before, in 1949, Mao Zedong and the Communists won. And even though China and Vietnam don't like each other, China wants to see themselves as the country. I'm talking about Red China, Mao Zedong's China, as the country that is going to help these revolutions, nationalist revolutions for independence, and it was a way to get back at the West, who they were furious with. So they had aid from the North. Guerrilla armies can win as long as they have a constant source of aid, because they don't need to win battles. They just need to survive. Because eventually, people like, let's say, the French or the United States, they're going to go home. We found that out. We're finding that out in Afghanistan. We're going home. The government the U.S. created, helped create and strengthen and somewhat considered to be a puppet government there, is negotiating with a group called the Taliban. And, they're going to create this kind of coalition government, but as soon as the U.S. is gone, the Taliban, who the U.S. drove out of power, will regain power. Just letting you know, that's the way these happen. Who knew it? And so they're in for the long haul, and they're determined, one Vietnam, independent. So, with that, the Viet Minh was strongest in the north, and these are French paratroopers. But up here, in the north, that's where they're strongest. Partially because of China, but also, as I mentioned before, in the south, there's more people who had converted to Catholicism in a majority Buddhist country, and and therefore the French had stronger forces. There are a lot of Viet Minh fighting in the south, but the main fighting will be the mountainous jungles of North Vietnam, which I guess is stunningly beautiful, but at the same time, mountains, jungle, winding roads. So the French, realizing that they have to establish and control the northern border, especially get to areas where they have some allies amongst people who live in the mountains, the Montagnards, we'll talk about them more a little bit later, they, in the late 1940s, were beginning to try to establish themselves. They got the south, and now around Hanoi. This map, the red shows a route called Route 4. RC4 just means essentially Highway 4. The French had built highways basically to connect. You think, oh, they're modernizing Vietnam. No, they're just trying to connect the rubber plantations to the coast. They're trying to suck all the wealth out. That's what colonies are. They wanted to take this road along the Chinese border and build bases along this road with the idea that this will reinforce their northern border and then an effort to then drive south and knock out the Viet Minh. Not really sure what the French plan really is, but the problem is this was a disaster. Long columns of French forces drove up the road and it became ambush hell. They were ambushed time after time after time. And especially where there were tunnels, like right here, tunnels through the mountains. And this turned out to be a disaster for the French. And then as soon as they drove through their long columns of men, the Viet Minh just poured in around them. And it was almost impossible to get supplies. Supplies had to be driven on the road. The road is being ambushed all the time. Long supply lines are going to crush the Vietnamese or the French. They're in real trouble. I need a drink, sorry. And so with that, the French would try what the British had tried in South Africa. Other countries would trying to hold against a guerrilla war. The United States would try it in South Vietnam. They called it the De La Tre line, or the De La Tra line. And that he was a general, very young general, French general in World War II, commanded an armored division. And when there were free French forces and they started liberating France, over 1 million Frenchmen fought against the Germans. Finally a chance to get them back in 44, 45. And so they're going to build a series of bunkers. And here's a very stylized picture of French forces looking over the bunker with traps we'll talk about called punji sticks to stop them. We'll talk about that later. Here is a bunker now that's, some of these bunkers, there's bunkers still there, these big cement bunkers. And the plan was it would be almost impossible for the Viet Minh to infiltrate that line. And therefore they could control the area around Hanoi and then go out and attack because they know the Viet Minh has to be outside that line. And then slowly expand outward. And therefore control their supply lines and use this as a base. It failed miserably. There was no way they could defend all this land. The Viet Minh easily went right past the defenses, just infiltrated right into Hanoi. They did a series of high-profile attacks. And it showed the difficulty of defending this land in the jungle, mountainous terrain, against people, the French are doing this against the Viet Minh, who have the support of average French or average Vietnamese civilians. And the also thought was they would use French planes. They used mostly supplied by the United States, and they would begin to bomb using mostly napalm and other things to try to knock them out. Well, this created more enemies against the French. And here is a napalm attack, jelly gasoline. And as the war went on, they tried another maneuver called Operation Lorraine. So the De La Tre line had failed. Driving on mountain roads failed. But parachutists. Here are parachutists, French parachutists landing. And what they did is, they did a series of parachute drops along the frontier. And this actually had a short-term, really positive effect. They would come in, drop parachutists, and they would take the Viet Minh totally by surprise. Take a base, sometimes capture headquarters, sometimes capture supplies. They had great effect. They seemed to work really well, and then the problem hit. Paratroopers have a limited amount of supplies. They only can carry a couple days worth of food and limited ammunition. Ammunition is really heavy. And so supplies have to be airdropped. They don't have a lot of heavy weapons. They rigged out systems to drop some artillery and even light tanks, but not very many. And you need oil and gasoline and all that. And so How do you reinforce them? Well, you have to drive on land. I think you see the problem. And so they had short-term effects, but in the long run, these paratroopers, a lot of them took heavy casualties because they had to fight their way out through ambushes. And it was after Lorraine in 1951. Lorraine is actually a province in eastern France, beautiful area near the German border. But some of you might remember that Alsatian-Lorraine events leading up to World War I. It was after this, in about 51, that the French realized, we're not going to be able to keep our colony. This is not working. We don't have enough men. We don't have enough supplies. We're just going to let them become independent. But while this is going on, sorry, I got to check something. While this is going on, the Cold War has heated up, so to speak. While Lorraine took place, the United States was fighting in Korea, and China had intervened in Korea, so the U.S. was fighting Chinese forces, and don't forget, China was helping France. This to the U.S. went from being, well, we want to help France keep their colony, to France is fighting a war on the front lines against communism, and then Vietnam falls, it's the Philippines, and then Wyoming. All a nice row of dominoes. It's all part of it. And even though the Viet Minh have been fighting for 50 years, to the U.S. point of view, this is part of the Soviet plan to conquer the United States and the West. World domination. So by 52, the U.S. was supplying over 2/3 of all the weapons that the French were using. The U.S. were paying for their war. There were over 550,000 French troops fighting in French Indo-China, and the U.S. was paying for this. And the French wanted out. They were losing 1,000 men a month. I should add, that's what we lose from COVID every day. Here, so I'll give you an idea of the casualty numbers and how bad things are now. And so the French were going to try one more operation in 1954 called the Navarre plan. And their plan was to drop parachutists in the northern mountains of French Indo-China, which is now very far northwest Vietnam, at a place called Dien Bien Phu. They'll drop parachutists in. These are the parachutists getting ready. Those are actually American C-47 transports. These are French transports. Drop them in. Boom. Take Dien Bien Phu. Knock out the supply line. Now, the U.S. supported this idea. That's a great plan. But the French plan was to win a victory so they could get out of Vietnam. They were actually thinking, if we can win a victory, we'll negotiate leaving. We're going to give them their independence. But maybe we could get something we want in the south around Saigon. To the U.S., they didn't know that was a French plan. It would blow up in both of their faces. I should add, they're going to have the same supply problems. Now, helicopters would have helped immensely, but helicopters were brand new, and France only had 2. The reason I'm mentioning this is, in 1965, when U.S. planners began to think about entering this guerrilla war, the United States had thousands of helicopters. And that's why the U.S. thought we could win. The French didn't have helicopters. We have helicopters. Change everything. And on that happy note, and that's right where I talked about the French parachuting in, but they were quickly surrounded and besieged. That's where I started yesterday. I wanted to get this in. And so I hope this works. I will, now you know the material. There is a quiz. And sorry about not coming on Monday. It's interesting stuff. Tomorrow we start the fog of war. If I can get it online, I will. If not, we'll see. I don't know why I'm doing this on my shoulder, but I wanted to. All right. Have a great day. Don't forget your interview, and I'll see you tomorrow.